Canada just drew a line in the sand. Here's the story everyone's missing. Washington recently marched into Congress with a comprehensive set of requirements for Canada, not suggestions, requirements. And the answer they received back changed the entire dynamic. Absolutely not happening. Let me set the stage properly. Intelligence is surfacing that Jamieson Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative, recently appeared before Congress discussing the forthcoming assessment of the North American Trade Agreement. This assessment is scheduled for July 2026. It's not optional. The three nations must convene and determine whether to extend this arrangement for another 16 years or allow it to gradually expire through yearly assessments until it terminates in 2036. Now, here's where the situation becomes compelling. Greer didn't arrive with proposals. He arrived with non-negotiable terms. First requirement, expand access to Canada's dairy sector. Washington wants substantially greater ability to market American dairy goods across the border. Second, eliminate the provincial prohibitions on American spirits. 7 of 10 Canadian provinces have removed U.S. liquor from distribution as retaliation for tariffs. Third, modify Canada's digital platform legislation requiring services like Netflix and Spotify to prioritize Canadian material. And fourth, discontinue what Washington characterizes as discriminatory government purchasing practices in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. That's substantial. But hold on, it escalates further. Intelligence is now validating that Greer essentially informed Congress that the trade arrangement has achieved success to a certain extent. That expression right there represents diplomatic vocabulary for dissatisfaction. He proceeded further and stated, quote, "I don't believe we can characterize the arrangement as an unqualified achievement, so allow me to interpret what just transpired." The United States Trade Representative entered a congressional proceeding and publicly declared that America's trade framework with its 2 principal trading partners isn't functioning. And he's communicating very explicitly that if Canada and Mexico don't begin offering concessions, this arrangement might not receive renewal. That's the foundation. Now, here's the element that kept me awake recently. Prime Minister Mark Carney was questioned about these requirements. Specifically, he was questioned about dairy, and his response was instantaneous. He responded in French initially, a direct communication to Quebec, where dairy producers are intensely safeguarded. Then he articulated it in English. Supply management is not under consideration, not we'll evaluate it, not let's explore this, not under consideration. Then Doug Ford, Ontario's premier, was questioned about the spirits prohibition. You know his response? Wine revenue in Ontario has increased 67%. Craft distilleries are experiencing double-digit expansion. Canadian wines have risen between 58 and 79%, depending on which data you examine. Ford essentially communicated, and I'm summarizing here, that when the Prime Minister and the President ultimately negotiate a significant agreement, perhaps a few bottles of Kentucky bourbon will return. Until that moment, everything remains prohibited. This is not the demeanor of a nation scrambling to negotiate. This is the attitude of a nation that possesses alternatives. And then Carney articulated something that made me replay the press conference 3 occasions just to verify I heard it accurately. A journalist questioned him what Canada actually desires from this arrangement. His response was essentially a demonstration in negotiation. He discussed genuine integration in the automotive sector, constructing the next generation of transportation together. He referenced aerospace. Then he transitioned to the fundamental matter, aluminum. Canadian aluminum shipments to the United States, he clarified, are assisting America in conserving an electricity quantity equivalent to the production of 10 Hoover dams. Consider that. Aluminum manufacturing is among the most energy-demanding industrial operations on the planet. If the U.S. had to manufacture all that aluminum internally, it would require enormous power quantities, power that's already necessary for data facilities, AI infrastructure, electric transportation charging networks, and fundamental economic expansion. Canada manufactures that aluminum in Quebec, where hydroelectric energy is plentiful and inexpensive. It's not merely trade, it's strategic resource distribution. But here's what nobody's discussing. Carney then referenced Ontario's Ring of Fire initiative. It's a substantial mining territory in northern Ontario, containing some of the planet's richest deposits of strategic minerals: nickel, cobalt, lithium, rare earth components, the materials that power batteries, semiconductors, and defense technology. And then he articulated this. It's a potential opportunity for the United States, but it's not a guaranteed opportunity for the United States. Wait, did he just communicate what I believe he communicated? Canada is developing these resources. They're constructing infrastructure. They're finalizing agreements with indigenous communities. They're advancing forward. And if the United States desires access to those minerals, they're going to have to approach the table with conditions that function for Canada. Because as Carney articulated very explicitly, we have alternative partners globally, in Europe, for instance, who are extremely interested in participating in those value chains. Allow that to register for a moment. The United States is requiring concessions on dairy and platform regulations. Canada is discussing who receives access to the minerals that will power the next 50 years of technological advancement. These are not equivalent positions. Now, let me demonstrate why this matters substantially more than it appears on the surface. The United States is entering this assessment with a catalog of grievances, dairy restrictions, spirits prohibition, digital platform regulations, provincial purchasing practices. And there's one element you'll observe about that catalog. It's all minor scale issues. What's absent? Steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, automotive tariffs, lumber tariffs. Those are the significant ones, the ones that actually harm Canadian exporters. And Greer didn't reference a single one of them in his testimony. That silence is revealing. Either Washington isn't prepared to utilize those tariffs as negotiating instruments, or they comprehend that introducing them would reveal a fundamental vulnerability in their position. Because here's the reality. Those tariffs aren't exclusively harming Canada. They're harming American consumers and enterprises too. Tariffs on Canadian aluminum elevate manufacturing expenses for U.S. producers. Steel tariffs increase construction and infrastructure expenses. Lumber tariffs are pushing housing costs higher at a moment when America is confronting a massive housing affordability emergency. So when Greer discusses dairy market access and spirits prohibition, what he's genuinely doing is avoiding the matters where the United States has already undermined itself. But that's not even the most intriguing element. Here's what I'm monitoring. Canada is no longer operating defensively. For years, whenever there was a trade confrontation with the United States, Canada was reactive, scrambling to respond, attempting to minimize damage. That's not what's transpiring now. Documentation reveals that earlier this year, Canada and the United States were extraordinarily close to a sector-by-sector arrangement. I mean, genuinely close. That package was anticipated to reduce tariffs on steel, aluminum, and potentially even lumber. There were even discussions about reviving the Keystone XL pipeline as component of a broader agreement. Then, Ontario broadcast an advertisement during the World Series. You might recall it. The advertisement featured Ronald Reagan discussing how protectionism doesn't function. Officials are now stating that President Trump observed that advertisement and was infuriated. Negotiations immediately stalled. When journalists questioned Carney about it, pay attention to what he executed. He didn't blame Doug Ford. He didn't throw anyone under transportation. He simply stated that Canada had been very close to an arrangement. From Canada's perspective, those conditions are still under consideration. And if the United States desires to return to the negotiating table this weekend, Canada is prepared to sit down and discuss. That's leadership under pressure. No panic, no finger pointing, just a clear statement of where circumstances stand. Then a journalist questioned Ford about the advertisement. Ford characterized it as the finest advertisement ever broadcast. He stated it reached 12.4 billion impressions. Now that figure is almost certainly inflated, but there's no denying that it became viral. And here's the reality. One journalist attempted to generate tension by informing Ford that Carney appeared to grimace when Ford characterized it as the finest advertisement of all time. Ford's response was perfect. He stated essentially that he believes the two of them constitute a very powerful team. One, a strategically minded economist, the other, a seasoned entrepreneur, one full of concepts, the other prepared to execute immediately. That is politics at the highest level. Ford transformed what could have been a divisive moment into a point of strength. This is not the disjointed Canada that stumbled through the original North American Free Trade Agreement renegotiation. This is a coordinated operation. Now, here's where the narrative takes a turn. The latest intelligence demonstrates that Canada's negotiating posture has fundamentally transformed since early 2025. Multiple sources validate that Carney has recently stated that the decades-long period of deepening economic integration with the United States has concluded. He's discussing a new strategy diversifying trade and reducing excessive dependence on the southern market. And it's not just discussion. Canada is finalizing additional arrangements with Europe. Port capacity is being expanded in Montreal and Vancouver. There are serious discussions about developing Churchill, Manitoba into a genuine northern port, constructing additional LNG terminals on the west coast to ship natural gas to Asia, even the possibility of building another oil pipeline to the Pacific. It sounds ambitious, but it's hardly unrealistic. Examine Australia, geographically isolated, all of its trade moves by sea or air, yet it's one of the world's most successful trading economies. It exports more liquefied natural gas than Canada. It trades extensively across the Indo-Pacific region, geographically remote but commercially integrated. Canada has an even greater advantage. We share the longest land border in the world with the United States that has traditionally made commerce extraordinarily efficient. But if that relationship becomes unpredictable or adversarial, Canada has demonstrated that it can pivot. And this brings me to what I believe is the most revealing detail in this entire narrative. Remember that catalog of requirements Greer brought to Congress: dairy, digital platforms, spirits, procurement practices. What he didn't bring up speaks volumes. He's requesting Canada to make concessions, but he's not offering anything in exchange. That's not negotiation. That's demanding unilateral capitulation. And Canada has made it very explicit that it has no interest in that kind of approach. Let me demonstrate something that changes the entire calculation. The assessment scheduled for July 2026 isn't just about extending an arrangement, it's about leverage. And right now, the balance of power is not where Washington believes it is. Here's what the data actually demonstrates. U.S. exports to Canada and Mexico have increased by 56% since 2020, when this trade arrangement came into force. That's nearly $1 trillion in exports in 2024 alone. The arrangement has provided a certain degree of stability to North American commerce. In Mexico, wages in some sectors have nearly doubled thanks to labor reforms embedded in the agreement. So it's fair to state that the arrangement is functioning. The problem is that it's not functioning the way Washington anticipated. And that brings us back to dairy, because this is where circumstances become genuinely interesting. The United States dairy sector has been complaining for years that Canada's tariff rate quotas under the arrangement aren't functioning as intended. On paper, Canada has allocated quotas for American dairy goods, but most of those quotas went to Canadian processors, firms that have little incentive to actually import additional U.S. dairy. So technically, Canada is complying with the letter of the arrangement, but in practice, it's largely stripped the agreement of its original purpose. Beyond that, Canada has been accused of exporting surplus skim milk solids onto global markets at artificially low prices. From Washington's perspective, this not only distorts Canada's domestic market, but also harms U.S. producers worldwide. So the complaints aren't entirely baseless. But here's the element that nobody's connecting. Canada's dairy sector operates under a supply management system. It's been in place since the 1970s. It establishes production quotas and limits imports to ensure stable prices for farmers. For Quebec especially, this system is politically untouchable. It's not just an economic policy, it's a cultural institution, and Carney made it very explicit. Supply management is a red line. There is no room for negotiation. But wait, it becomes more complicated. While the United States is pushing on dairy, Canada is holding firm, and simultaneously, Ontario's spirits prohibition is actually benefiting Canadian manufacturers. Wine revenue is up, craft distilleries are thriving, domestic products are displacing American imports. What was supposed to harm Ontario has instead become a boost for local producers. So here's the question. If the prohibition is assisting Canadian enterprises, why would Ontario ever lift it? Ford made his position explicit. He'll consider bringing American spirits back when there's a truly excellent agreement for both nations. Until then, everything remains on pause. Now, let me demonstrate what Canada is genuinely doing here, because this isn't just about defending dairy or supporting local wine. This is about reshaping the negotiating framework entirely. When Carney discusses the Ring of Fire, he's not just discussing a mining initiative, he's discussing leverage. The Ring of Fire is located approximately 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. It contains massive deposits of chromite, nickel, copper, platinum, and rare earth components. These are the minerals that power electric transportation batteries, semiconductor manufacturing, and defense technology. The global competition for these minerals is intensifying by the day. China currently controls much of the rare earth refining operation. The United States is attempting to construct domestic supply chains to reduce dependence on Beijing. Canada has the reserves, Canada has processing capacity, Canada has political stability, but Canada also has alternatives. The European Union is mobilizing aggressively to secure supplies of critical minerals. It's offering trade arrangements, investment packages, and ambitious technology partnerships. So when Carney states that Canada has alternative partners globally, that's not rhetorical posturing. It's a statement of fact. And this is where the balance of power begins to shift decisively. The United States has entered this round of negotiations focused on dairy restrictions and spirits prohibition. Canada, by contrast, is discussing the future of electric transportation, semiconductor manufacturing, and energy security. These are not approaches of equal weight. And then there's the electricity matter. The latest intelligence reveals that Alberta's grid operator has been accused of unfairly blocking Montana-based electricity providers. U.S. officials claim that during periods of surplus supply or transmission congestion, Alberta favors in-province generation over comparably priced U.S. power. Alberta's government has rejected the claim, but it's on Greer's catalog of grievances. So let me comprehend this correctly. The United States is complaining that Canada won't purchase enough American electricity, while simultaneously Canada is conserving America massive electricity quantities by manufacturing aluminum internally in Quebec. The contradictions in Washington's position are starting to accumulate. Now, here's what I believe is most likely to transpire. And let me be explicit, this is analysis, not prediction, because with this administration, nothing is ever fully predictable. I believe that sometime around this spring, the United States will begin to recognize that it requires this arrangement more than Canada does. Canada's economy may be smaller in absolute terms, but Canada has political stability. It holds resources the world increasingly requires, and it's steadily constructing alternative trade relationships. By contrast, the United States is confronting multiple pressures simultaneously: inflation, a housing affordability emergency, massive infrastructure investment requirements. All of these are areas where Canadian inputs and products could meaningfully ease the burden. For that reason, I believe Washington's position will eventually soften, not publicly. This administration rarely concedes ground publicly, but behind closed doors at the negotiating table, I anticipate far greater flexibility to emerge. Let me demonstrate why July 2026 is going to be one of the most significant months in North American trade history. If the three nations fail to agree next summer on extending the arrangement for another 16 years, the agreement doesn't automatically collapse. Instead, it enters an annual assessment mechanism. Each year until 2036, all three parties must return to the table and attempt to reach consensus. That means 10 years of uncertainty, 10 years in which enterprises won't know whether to continue investing in cross-border supply chains, 10 years of strategic limbo. In reality, no nation genuinely desires that outcome, but avoiding it will require someone to yield first. And at this point, Canada has demonstrated absolutely no indication of backing down. What we're witnessing is not simply a trade confrontation, it's a profound realignment in the relationship between Canada and the United States. Officials are now stating openly that the balance of power has shifted completely since early 2025. In the past, Canada was always on the defensive, reacting to tariff threats, attempting to minimize damage. That is no longer the case. Canada is now firmly in the driver's seat. And here's the detail that almost everyone is missing. Greer has laid out a lengthy catalog of requirements: dairy restrictions, digital services tax, spirits prohibition, procurement practices, but he's almost entirely silent on the biggest matters. He doesn't reference steel tariffs, he doesn't reference aluminum tariffs, he doesn't address automotive tariffs, and he states nothing about lumber. 4 major sectors of Canada's economy are still subject to U.S. punitive tariffs that exist entirely outside the trade arrangement framework. And it's precisely that silence which is most telling. Either the administration is not yet prepared to utilize those tariffs as negotiating instruments, or it comprehends that merely raising them would reveal fundamental vulnerabilities in its overall position. Because the reality is straightforward. Those tariff barriers are directly harming consumers and enterprises inside the United States itself. Tariffs on Canadian aluminum elevate manufacturing expenses for U.S. producers. Steel tariffs increase construction and infrastructure expenses. Lumber tariffs push housing costs higher, exactly the sector Carney has explicitly identified as requiring urgent relief. In other words, Washington is entering negotiations from a position of self-inflicted economic damage. Meanwhile, what is Canada's biggest problem? That it cannot market more dairy into a market that's already oversupplied, or that it's not importing bourbon at a moment when domestic wine and spirits are selling better than ever. When placed side by side, the imbalance in leverage becomes strikingly explicit. Now, let me tell you what I'm monitoring most closely. The question is whether the United States is willing to offer any meaningful concessions in exchange for its requirements. Because at this point, Washington appears to be requesting Canada to concede on dairy and the digital services tax while offering nothing in exchange on steel, aluminum, and lumber tariffs, tariffs that are inflicting genuine damage on some of Canada's most critical sectors. That is not negotiation. That is simply demanding unilateral concessions. And Canada has made it very explicit that it has no interest in that kind of approach. The assessment scheduled for July is going to be fascinating to monitor. All three nations will sit down at the table. Mexico, for its part, is pursuing its own path. In fact, it's been more tactical than Canada in securing certain tariff advantages for agricultural goods, quietly working directly with the administration. Canada has chosen a more openly confrontational approach, but one that is also firmer on core matters such as supply management. And ultimately, the United States will have to answer a fundamental question. Does it desire a strong, integrated North American economy capable of competing with China and other global powers? Or does it desire to win narrow points at the negotiating table, even if that comes at the expense of long-term relationships? Because right now, watching Carney and Ford stand calmly refusing Washington's requirements while openly discussing opportunities with alternative partners, I have to admit this is not the Canada I remember from past trade battles. And I'm not sure Washington genuinely knows how to deal with a Canada like this. Here's what keeps me awake at night, though. The global competition over strategic minerals is intensifying by the day. China controls most of the rare earth refining operation. The United States is scrambling to construct domestic supply chains. Europe is mobilizing to secure its own supplies. Canada has what everyone requires. But Canada is making it very explicit that access is not guaranteed. It's conditional. It depends on partnership, not pressure. And that fundamentally changes the dynamic. When Greer appears in July with his catalog of requirements about dairy and platform regulations, Carney is going to appear with a different conversation entirely. One about energy security, one about semiconductor supply chains, one about the minerals that will power the next century of technological advancement. And here's the reality. Canada doesn't need to win every argument. It just needs to make it explicit that it has alternatives, because the moment Washington recognizes that Canada can genuinely pivot to alternative markets, that changes everything. I'm genuinely curious where this leads. Will Canada's strategy of constructing alternatives and holding its ground actually deliver results? Or will economic gravity eventually pull it back into dependence on the U.S. market? What do you believe transpires in July when all three sides sit down to reassess the entire framework? Will one party yield, or are we heading into a prolonged period of uncertainty with annual assessment cycles stretching year after year? Because right now, the script has been flipped, and I'm not entirely sure anyone anticipated this coming.